there were days where I couldn't share what was actually going on. So it's an absolute blessing to be able to sit in the seat and hold that space for other men in similar positions. I agree. And I remember going to those appointments and almost wanting to be like a ninja, trying to like hide. Is somebody going to see me going in? Am I going to see somebody in the waiting room? What are people going to think? But I remember walking out of that session and just feeling like the weight of the world had lifted off of me.
A lot of the anxiety, depression that especially men feel, like you said, comes from that lack of purpose. Feeling lost or feeling like I should be doing more or I could be doing more. It's a really heavy burden.
Like how much success, how much money, how much you name it. I mean, it can be one of those things that really pushes us to succeed in a good way sometimes, but then it's that very fine line of now it's becoming counterproductive, not feeling enough, the I'm not good enough negative belief or limiting belief. I'd say 95% of everybody that reaches out to me, that's something that they're dealing with. Could have been something that happened in childhood, could have been a relationship gone wrong, a business failure, whatever it might be. Something is reinforcing that belief of I'm not good enough. I acknowledge it. It's tough. It's a scary thing to do. But taking that first step to reach out, which is often the hardest step, is going to pay dividends.
All right, welcome back to the Wellness Dojo Podcast. I'm your host, Craik, and I'm excited to have Dustin Hogan here from Therapy for Dudes. Dustin, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, man. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I'm excited to just riff on all things men's mental health, therapy, counseling, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, dude, let's dive into it.
Cool, man. So before we get too deep and heavy into it, can you just tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, a little bit about Therapy for Dudes?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a men's mental health counselor. Have been building my practice for the last couple of years and working with men throughout Alberta, in BC as well. Recently launched Therapy for Dudes, which is kind of the next iteration in the growth of my business, the growth of my practice, to be able to support more men with their mental health and really just breaking down the stigma of men seeking support for their mental health. So could not be more excited. Actually just launched it this week. So it's been a really busy week, and this is a nice way to finish it off and talk a little bit more about it.
I love it. How has the launch gone so far?
It's gone well, man. I mean, I've been blown away and humbled by all of the support, all of the comments, all of the shares, both men and women, really just supporting the mission. And yeah, it feels really good and quite exciting, actually.
Yeah, it is really cool to see that men's mental health is moving to the forefront. Like we're getting more attention around the need for it.
Yeah.
Right. And there's so much support around it, like you said.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, it's been awesome, man. Super, super humbling. And went out last night with my parents for dinner to kind of celebrate everything and just
awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big step to get to this point. But what I was saying to my dad last week is it actually feels like I'm just at the base camp of Everest now, and the real climb is going to begin. But I could not be more excited.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm super excited for you.
Thanks, man.
So, like, I want to hear a little bit more about your journey as well. Like, how did you get to this place where this is what you wanted to do with your life?
Yeah, I mean, how long is the podcast?
Yeah, right.
I mean, I've always been somebody that's dealt with anxiety and depression growing up, and I had so much support around me from friends and family, but there was this other part that really felt like I needed to kind of keep it quiet and show up as this confident, charismatic guy all of the time. And there've been some dark days where I've really been at some of my darkest points. So when things haven't gone well as far as businesses or relationships crumbling, and it kind of built to this point where 3-4 years ago I was really about 5 years ago actually, I was really at rock bottom, not really knowing where I was going or what I was doing, and it was painful, man, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And at that time, when I was really just trying to figure out what the next steps were, I'd always thought about getting into counseling and going back to school. But, it's like, okay, do I commit the time to go back to school, or what do I do? But thankfully, 2019 made the decision to go back to school for counseling. And right when I signed up for that program, I knew that I wanted to focus in on men's mental health. Wasn't even a decision in my mind. And, you know, there's still obviously been some ups and downs over these last 3-4 years since I've been at school and finished. But like I said, when I started that program, I knew right away I wanted to focus on men's mental health. Just like I said, as my journey going through it and feeling like there were days where I couldn't share what was actually going on. So it's an absolute blessing to be able to sit in the seat and hold that space for other men in similar positions.
Yeah. I love that. And I'm super into right now, like listening to the inner voice and that inner pull. So it's cool to hear you kind of describe that.
Yeah.
As well as like, it was automatic. Like I knew this was it. Like this is what I wanted to do.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know how it was going to work out, but I knew that that's what I wanted the focus to be. And could not be happier with how things are going right now and getting to support men and all different backgrounds, all different ages, just at different ages and stages as well.
Yeah. And you described something that I think resonates probably with a lot of men who are listening to this episode, even women as well. But that like having all these burdens, these heavy emotions and stuff, but feeling like we can't share it. I think that's something that, especially for men, just weighs on us a lot. You almost feel like, even sitting here saying that, I almost feel guilty saying it. Like there's like this burden of like, I don't want to say the wrong thing and like try and make it feel like men have it worse than women, because it's not. Like we're all very equal. Of course. But there is that, like you mentioned, a stigma. For sure. That.
Yeah, and especially here in Alberta, right? Like I work with a lot of guys up in the oil field, and you know, I might be the only person that they've ever shared some of these things with, and yet they're carrying that burden throughout their lives, not even chatting with things with their wife in some cases. And it's a lot of weight. It's a lot of weight on our shoulders. But I found that having that space, even just for myself, like when I found a therapist that I could sit down with, that I could truly be open with, dude, it was like a game changer, absolute game changer. And since then, now being able to be more open with everybody that's in my life, parents, friends, you know, my sister, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. When you first started that process of going to therapy and talking to somebody, what was that experience like for you? Were you going into it like very guarded? Were you very open to it? Was it what you expected it to be? I'm curious.
It's a good question. Yeah, so I saw my first counselor, psychologist, actually probably 20 years ago for anxiety at the time. And I remember that was here in Calgary. And I remember going to those appointments and almost wanting to be like a ninja, trying to like hide. Is somebody going to see me going in? Am I going to see somebody in the waiting room? What are people going to think? And I mean, that added anxiety to someone that was already dealing with a lot of anxiety. So yeah, I mean, certainly kind of felt that. And then even other therapists I've seen over the years, I've had similar feelings. But when I saw this guy back in 2018, that's really where things shifted, only because internally I made the decision that I was going to tell this guy everything, every dark secret that I'd buried deep within. And dude, I remember going into that session that day. This is when I was living in Vancouver at the time. And the terror that I had going into that session of thinking to myself, I'm going to tell this guy everything. But I remember walking out of that session and just feeling like the weight of the world had lifted off of me, because now there was somebody that knew everything about me, and it gave me the comfort and the confidence to then have those tougher conversations with my parents, with my sister, with my wife at the time, and really put it all out there. Not without fear, because there was still fear, but I had to cross that chasm, so to speak, to be able to have that conversation. So when guys show up in session with me, and I know that for many of them, just booking that call, that initial call, is probably one of the hardest things that they've ever had to do. Yet at the end of it, you can feel that weight come off them. Yeah. Simply because now they've put something out there that they've maybe carried around for their entire life.
Yeah. Very cool. Can you pinpoint like when you made that decision? You said like you had made a decision, like I'm going to go in, I'm going to share everything. Was there something that happened with you where you were like, I'm just going to, and only share what you're comfortable with?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, quite frankly, at that point I was dealing with suicidal ideation. There was never any plan in place. But just the fact that these were the thoughts that were coming up in my mind. And as someone that only wanted to live, I was just like, man, I can't deal with this burden on my own. And of course I'm scared to have that conversation. What does this mean? Does this mean there's something wrong with me? Is he going to send me to the hospital? Like on and on all of these things went. So that was really that breaking point where I said, I can't carry this burden with me any longer. And of course, there's still been times when those thoughts have come in. I now have so many tools in my toolbox to be able to deal with it. But that was really that breaking point where career wasn't going the way that I wanted it to, was stuck, mid-30s at that time. Like, what's the next 30, 40 years of my life going to look like? And just these relentless thoughts, these dark thoughts coming up in my head. So that was really the catalyst that pushed me.
Yeah. Well, good for you. That's
Thanks,
awesome.
man.
That's awesome. There's this like masculine mindset. I say that because I know there's women that experience it as well. But that idea of like, I haven't reached my breaking point yet, so like I can still keep pushing, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, men in particular, they wait until they get to that breaking point, right?
Oh yeah.
I've been there too, where I'm like, oh man, I just like can't take it anymore. I need to tell somebody.
Yeah.
Like, and then when you do, you're like, man, I wish I talked about this like years ago or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's my default was always just work harder. If things aren't going well, just push harder. If things aren't, going according to plan, just put in more effort. And putting in more effort up into a certain point is a tool, but beyond that, it actually becomes counterproductive. And so I've recognized that in myself now when I default to that of, okay, dude, you actually got to slow down now. Pushing harder is not the solution. So then seeing that in my clients and calling that out and offering some perspective is hard, because I'm a driven guy. I'm like, I've got big goals and big vision, yet sometimes putting the pause or hitting the pause button, that's what needs to happen, not pushing things harder.
Yeah. And that really resonates with what you said earlier about going back to school, right?
Yes.
It's like, that's a hard decision to make as a driven individual as well, because you just want to keep going on the path that you're on. To steer off on another path, that's a really scary thing to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to step back here, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. But it was like one of the, if not the best decisions that I've ever made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. For men that are listening to this that maybe haven't been to counseling or therapy or anything like that, like what does a session look like for people who come in?
That's a great question. And I mean, every session is going to look different depending on the counselor, depending on the therapist. Some sort of an intake session where you're talking about history and where you've been, where you're at right now, what you want to accomplish, and then coming up with some sort of a plan moving forward. Once again, it's going to differ from counselor to counselor. And one thing that I always say to guys that are thinking about it is you may not find the right fit the first conversation that you have. Because at the end of the day, fit is 80% of success in counseling. The content, the concepts, all of that can be learned, by going to school, but it ultimately comes down to the fit and the rapport that you have with whomever's on the other side of that conversation. So that's something that I always say to guys that are looking into it is don't be discouraged if the first person that you talk to isn't a home run. That's okay. And then beyond that, there's going to be potentially weekly sessions or bi-weekly sessions. I incorporate a lot of action, a lot of accountability with the guys that I work with, because one of the things that I say in the initial meeting is your life is actually spent outside of our sessions. So if I'm not equipping you with tools and strategies to be able to work on, not to say that those conversations are a waste, but they're just not as effective as they could be. So I really place a high priority on action and accountability. So, maybe finding somebody that does something similar is going to create, in my experience, the most results.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing that I've learned about therapy as well, is that I think a lot of people go into it with this clinical sense, like they're going to see their doctor.
Yeah.
Like it's just an appointment, you're going to see your doctor, but it's a lot different than that, because like you said, you're building rapport. You're building a relationship with somebody, because you don't just go in the first day, most people, and share everything. Some people do, right? But like you're building trust and relationship, and like seeing if there is that connection there. And then if there's not, it's kind of like dating in a sense.
100%, man. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like you're both sussing each other out, getting to learn each other's, idiosyncrasies in some ways. And I'm going to say this and it's going to land in a certain way. So yeah, it does take time.
Yeah. I like what you said, because I think it's really important for people to know that you don't have to like commit to the first person you go and see. Same, totally. Like I said, same thing with dating. Yeah. You don't have to commit to that person fully. Like just see, like test the water, see if it works for both of you. And then, you can always try different people too.
Totally. And what I do in my practice is there's always a 15-minute discovery call before we even start session, because we got to see if there's a connection there, at least somewhat of a connection, get an idea of what they want, if I'm even the right fit, because I'm not always the best fit. And if I'm not, I'll potentially share another resource for somebody else that may be a better fit. So yeah, being willing to date and to try counselors out and see what fits. And if it doesn't, that's okay. Try somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a lot of pressure off, I think, for people.
Totally, man.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned something earlier I want to get into a little bit. The physical, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual. I do this thing with my clients called the Wellness Wheel. And so we look at like all these different aspects, like financial, career, emotional, physical, and we kind of rate them. Yeah. And we see like how full are these areas in your life, and then you can look at it as like how do those things affect each other. And we always see there's so much like leak into the different areas. They're like either pulling each other up or weighing each other down. Can you speak to that a little bit, on just the importance of all those different areas, like not just focusing on your mental health, but also spiritual, physical, and how they relate
for sure. And I mean, as dudes, we kind of default to the mental and the cognitive, right? Yeah. Like problem solvers, we're fixers. So how can I think my way through this? So the first piece that I tend to introduce with most clients is an emotions wheel. So, you're talking about kind of the wellness wheel, and I introduce an emotions wheel where being able to just identify with precision, with accuracy, what you're actually feeling, and then being able to use that piece of information and that data to have an understanding of where things are at. And then it actually makes the mental side of things that much more effective, because if we recognize our emotional state, we can get a better idea of how our thoughts are then driving our emotions. And then you bring in the physical aspect, which you probably know a heck of a lot more than I do, given your line of work. But right, treating our physical body as a temple. And it's not that they need to be eating like super clean and all of this. It's just, how can we use that other aspect of who you are to help build that foundation for just overall health. And then the spiritual side of things, of course, that's different with everybody, and depending on the client that I'm working with, it's different types of conversations. But at the end of the day, so many guys are looking for more purpose, and that's one of the big reasons that they reach out to me is, maybe they've got the career, maybe they've got the family, on paper things look fantastic, but they're missing that lack of purpose, or they're feeling like they've got a lack of purpose. And in a lot of cases, it's like, okay, what are you connected to in the bigger picture? And whether we call that spirituality or what have you, I'll meet the client where they're at. But without those four elements, those four pillars, really, it's hard to have an overall harmonious life. And I don't like to use the word balance. That idea of finding balance is something that, this is more of a personal opinion, but it's thrown around kind of loosely.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Right? But the moment we're in balance, 2 seconds later, we're out of balance. So I like to think of it like harmony, where, even the best songs, everything is at a different level, but they sound good together. Yeah. And to me, it's the same thing with those four pillars is, they may not be equal all of the time, but if they're in harmony, then to me, that's a harmonious life.
Yeah. And I like harmonious as well, because that to me brings up like connection. Yeah. And a really powerful thing for me in my life has been realizing how connected all of these things are. Like you can't have like you were saying, the emotional without the mental. You can't have the physical without the emotional. Like they're all related. We recognize this in our workouts as well. If we're having a bad mental day, like the workout's different. If we're emotionally drained, the workout's different, and vice versa. Yeah. Right? You have a great workout, emotionally you're feeling different. They're all connected. And that's just been a really powerful way to even just helped me personally go internal a little bit and be able to trust that voice and guide that purpose a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
I love it. Yeah. And it furthers the conversation too. We're not just talking about the mental side of things. It's like everything is connected.
Yeah. So I love purpose. Like I could talk purpose all day. So I want to talk a little bit about purpose and the power of purpose as well, because I think that a lot of and I'm making a generalization here, but a lot of the anxiety, depression that especially men feel, like you said, comes from that lack of purpose, comes from, that feeling lost or feeling like I should be doing more or I could be doing more. It's a really heavy burden. Where do you think that comes from?
The lack of purpose or the burden or what?
Just that pressure that we feel, I guess, for finding that purpose.
I mean, that's $1 billion question. I'd say it's a combination of society, potential, family situations or something that's happened growing up. And I mean, it's different, especially for us here in North America, in Canada, and then even a city like Calgary, where, success is placed at the top of the list for a lot of us, and just generally speaking, it's a message that's put out there. So I think it's a combination of environment, but then also just who we are at a personal level, and that feeling of, and I mean, I've had it myself, of how much is enough, right? Like how much success, how much money, how much you name it. So yeah, I mean, it can be one of those things that really pushes us to succeed in a good way sometimes, but then it's that very fine line of now it's becoming counterproductive, and it's maybe pushing us into a darker area where, that push for success and even the comparison trap, I mean, that's a huge reason for a lack of mental health and emotional health for a lot of the guys that I work with.
Yeah.
When on paper they have everything, yet they still feel empty, and the default is to try and fill that pit, but it's a bottomless pit. It's never going to be filled. So having those tough conversations of how much is enough. And trust me, dude, I'm speaking to myself right now, because these are conversations that I have with myself every day, is like, how much do I actually need? Yeah.
It's really interesting. I'm curious your opinion on this. I was having a conversation with a colleague recently, and we were talking about goals and purpose. Specifically, we started talking about goals, and I was just asking about their goals, like what goals do you have? And they had said something to me that I never actually really thought much about. And they said they actually don't set goals. They feel they put, like, the goals put too much pressure on them, right? And I was like, yeah, but the goals are a way to, like, work towards the purpose. Like, it's like a reachable target towards the purpose. I'm curious what your opinion is on, like, setting goals, achieving goals, and that overall pressure that comes along with it.
Yeah, and I'm a very goal-driven guy, so I definitely have set goals, and it's a big part of my yearly practice. I've shifted my approach to it, though, and there's 2 books. One book, The Vivid Vision, by a guy named Cameron. I can't remember his last name, but he's the former COO of 1-800-GOT-JUNK.
Okay.
And incredible concept in the book where it talks about having this 3-year vision of what you want your life to look like, what you want your business to look like, and then reverse engineering the process to then make that a reality, and then becoming the person that can accomplish that. So everything is kind of built off of that. And then the next book, Atomic Habits, which I know you're familiar with James Clear, and he talks about this idea of setting goals but following systems. And that's really the concept that I take, is having the goal there so I know what the destination is, but then just focusing in on the process and the system that's going to allow me to get there, and then making that the focus. Because that's more of who I am at an identity-based level, rather than sitting there and obsessing about what that goal is. I'm just focused on executing on that system on a daily basis, and then the goal ends up taking care of itself. Even if I never think about the goal again, I just focus in on what I need to do and fall in love with the system. And I mean, it's been an absolute game changer for me, because now at an identity-based level, I fall in love with the work, not necessarily the thing that's at the end of that work. Even though it still feels good to get that goal, that's not the ultimate focus. It's more so, okay, putting in the work, working the process, working the system, and falling in love with that.
Yeah. Yeah, the conversation really resonated because like I've felt that pressure. Like I've also been super goal oriented, and at times it's been crippling because I'm like, I have to hit that goal, and then all this pressure starts to snowball, and then it distracts you from the process.
Yeah.
Right. And when you can approach it with less expectation on like that you actually have to achieve the goal, and rather just that'll be a nice thing to achieve, but just focusing like less expectation and putting more kind of happiness and joy into the work again.
For sure.
Like you said, those goals just seem to come easier. That purpose starts to kind of fall into place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even this year with some of the goals that I'd set at the start of the year, I've already had to push the completion date out, and previous versions of me would have felt, you know, like a failure or unsuccessful, or maybe I'm not supposed to achieve that. But if it happens an extra 3 months or 12 months from when it was supposed to, does that really matter 10 years from now? Not really. Yeah. I mean, even therapy for dudes, like I've owned this URL for 2 years thinking that 3 months after that I would have this thing built, and 2.5 years later I just launched it. But it's exactly what needed to happen, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But previous versions of me I don't think would have been.
Yeah. Is that, do you think, related to this there's like this generational pressure with men in particular of having to be the provider? Like it's like this thing that is just like so rooted in us, even though we've become more awakened to the fact that like times are changing and it's not the case. It just feels like it is just so deep inside of us, this need to provide, this need to protect, and those types of things. Do you think that kind of plays into that as well, that pressure to achieve goals and have that purpose?
For sure. And a lot of it is self-induced. You know, the guys, especially so many guys that I work with, putting that pressure on to provide, to support, to protect, and they're doing all of that, yet it still doesn't feel enough. Not even because they've received feedback that it isn't enough. They just feel it isn't enough for whatever host of reasons that might be. So you can see when they kind of let some of that pressure off, it actually allows them to do those things at an even deeper level, because that expectation, they've now lowered the expectation on themselves, really.
Yeah. What are some of the reasons that you think we struggle so much with like that being enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because across the board, so many of my clients, regardless of their background, there's a self-esteem component to working with me. You know, not feeling enough, the I'm not good enough negative belief or limiting belief. I'd say 95% of everybody that reaches out to me, that's something that they're dealing with. Could have been something that happened in childhood, could have been a relationship gone wrong, a business failure, whatever it might be. Something is reinforcing that belief of I'm not good enough. And it's interesting because if we look at that belief, I think on the surface we just say, well, it's not serving us, we want to just get rid of it. But the other side of that coin actually is that I'm not good enough belief drives us to accomplish more, because once again we're trying to fill that gap that it's a bottomless pit. So one of the things that we do in the work with my clients is, okay, maybe we can't figure out exactly where that belief has come from, but we can figure out how it's impacting you on a day-to-day basis in your thoughts and your feelings and your behaviors, and then how those are reinforcing that belief. So it's really about peeling back those layers. So going back to your question, is I think a lot of that pressure is driven by certain negative or limiting beliefs, like I'm not good enough, or I'm not capable, or I'm not lovable. That's another big one as well. So it just comes down to being able to identify that and then starting to work backwards to really shift those. Yeah, that's super powerful. And it's like you said, it's something I know so many people struggle with. This feeling of like, I'm not enough, I'm not lovable, I'll never be lovable, like these types of things. And what popped in my mind when you were talking is just going back to that, like learning to enjoy the process as well. I think that really helps people distract from the I'm not enough or I'm not good enough or those types of things. Like just learning to like love that process again, and then it matters less how much you're achieving and that type of stuff, right? Well, and you learn to love yourself in the process as well. And this is, I'll just speak personally here, that's been the case for me, is it's been a process of trying to learn to love myself at a deeper level, even though I'm surrounded by it with friends and family. Internally, that's often a big struggle for me as well.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. Let's dive into that a little bit. Just like, because it's something that I know there's probably some guys out there listening and they're like rolling their eyes, like, oh, love yourself, right? It seems like such like this like kind of woo-woo thing, concept.
Yeah.
But it's such an important thing. It's such an overlooked thing. And myself as well, like relating back to my own personal journey, like that's been such a huge thing through transformative periods in life, is to just learn to appreciate yourself. And not that you don't want to have other people appreciate you in your life. Like that's important that you set boundaries and that you like make sure you surround yourself with those people. But so important to just learn to appreciate yourself and be your biggest cheerleader and those types of things, right?
Yeah, and it's tough. It's tough at times when that critical voice comes in, and it sometimes slides in very hidden ways of, you don't do something right and you're like, oh, idiot, or why did you do that? And we have to keep in mind that that's across a lifetime of little comments like that, little digs, and those are just small ones. I'm sure many people can relate to far worse things that we're saying to ourselves in our head, and they build and build and build, and they really become, going back to the habits, they become these habitual ways of thinking, of speaking, of behaving that just reinforce these beliefs at such a deep level that becomes the default. So yeah, I mean, and it's not like you need to have affirmations written all over your house. I'm the greatest. I love myself. You're like, but just those small little things where, good job, dude. Nice work. So I'm trying to do that to myself on a regular basis. If something goes well, nice job, or good effort there, praising those things like effort and attitude, not just praising accomplishments.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's what builds that long-term grit and perseverance. And I mean, there's even so many studies on that of parents not necessarily praising their kids for accomplishments, but praising them for effort, actually build more resilient adults in the long term.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, and that's something too that I think really helps build that love for yourself, is you have to, those small things, like it's like manifesting, right? It's like if you're constantly saying, I haven't achieved enough, or I haven't, like, you're almost manifesting your own failure. I don't know what your beliefs are on like manifestation and stuff like that, but like I believe in that kind of stuff. And like I've seen it in my life too, where when I'm encouraging myself more, or when I'm, like you said, celebrating my efforts more, it's like certain things seem to come easier, right? And it's just like a really powerful thing.
For sure, because then we're now on the lookout for it, right? And there's a part of our brain, I don't want to get too technical, but something called our reticular activating system, which essentially is just, it's part of our brain that scans our environment for information that's important to us. And the best way that I describe it is if you get a new vehicle, all of a sudden you start seeing that vehicle on the road more. It's not that they've gone out and manufactured more of that. Now that's just important to you, so your brain is spotting that vehicle on the road. So it's the same thing with what you're saying, is if we are praising ourselves more and almost even showing more gratitude, we're now deeming that to be important. So our brain is going to be paying more attention to other things that are going to reinforce that set of thoughts as well. Yeah. But it goes on the other side too, on the negative side, right? If we're constantly negative or critical, our brain's going to be looking for things to be negative and critical about. So what are we feeding ourselves?
Yeah, I've heard this concept before of like, you've got two wolves constantly. And it's about like, which wolf are you feeding? Like you've got this like negative, self-critical wolf, and then you've got this cheerleader wolf, for lack of a better term. And it's like, which one are you feeding more? That's the wolf that's going to eventually eat the other wolf, right? Yeah, really powerful. It's such a... one other thing that popped in my mind with just kind of loving yourself, I think it also helps really, like when you do the work and you start to feel that, right? You appreciate yourself more. It also takes a lot of pressure off of having to be enough for anybody else, because you start to realize that like, well, I'm enough for myself. And like, I've gone through this in my life where I'm like, well, as I start to appreciate myself more and recognize the good that I offer more, the love that I offer to the world and all that I offer, you start to realize that, you know, if certain things that you want to work out don't work out, you'll be okay.
Yeah.
Right. And it's almost like there's some, it's almost like a vindictive cycle that I've had in my head in the past too, where I'm like, that's your loss. Right. But it's also very empowering to look at life that way. It's like, I'm going to be good. Right. And I'll figure this out like I always do. And I'm just going to keep pouring love out to the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it builds on itself in so many ways. And I've found, at least in my own work and even with clients, when I'm at the best of myself or the best version of myself, it impacts my friends, it impacts my family, it impacts, you know, the person that I meet at Safeway. It's just this ripple effect that goes beyond just us.
Yeah. And vice versa too,
100%.
right? Because the people that you hang out, like if you're hanging around negative people, like that's a pretty obvious one for people. But also, are you hanging around people who are supporting your personal growth? Are you hanging around people who help you love yourself more, right? Or are you hanging around people who are taking more from you?
Yeah. Yeah. Energy vampires, I like to call those kinds of people.
Yeah, and they're very common in this world. Yeah. I've always said people, not in an intentional way, but people will take and take and take until there's nothing, until you like stop giving. You
Completely.
have to be very careful.
And we've got to set our boundaries, and it's sometimes easier said than done if it's people that are close to us, friends or family or whomever. But yeah, you're right. And in many cases, they're not, I don't believe they're intentionally trying to suck that energy out, but it does happen.
Yeah. How can people, do you think, start to kind of gain maybe some awareness on the people that are in their lives and how it's affecting them? Because I imagine that's probably a big thing that comes up as well, right? With relationships.
For sure. And it goes back to even our 4 pillars there, the emotional pillars. How do you feel when you're around people, right? And how does that make you, what kind of thoughts are coming up for you? You know, is there almost a feeling of avoidance or resistance that comes up? So that's why, like I said, one of the first tools I introduce to most clients is just a simple emotional wheel. That's actually one of the most powerful tools they'll put in their toolbox. Is, can you identify on the pleasant or the unpleasant side how you're feeling around these people, and then using that as a bit of a compass, so to speak. And then even just being clear on what your personal values are, because I like to think of our values as a life compass. And if there's a misalignment in values, someone's maybe showing up more negative, maybe you need to set up a bit of a boundary there.
Yeah.
Sometimes easier said than done, like I said, if it's family or close friends. However, if you're trying to prioritize your own well-being, tough decisions need to happen.
Yeah. And I like that you said values too, because it's not necessarily sometimes that somebody's like negative or that they're like being mean to you or anything, but sometimes you just recognize that the people that you're spending time with, like that your values really just don't align. They're not a bad person. No. They're not treating you super poorly, but it's just like the values don't align, and you recognize that when you're spending time with people whose values you do align more with, that you grow more, right? Yeah,
helps you rise up.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing that I've thought of as well, because you feel bad when you have to set boundaries against people, like towards people, or when you have to, I always think of the circle of influence, where it's like, I'm not cutting this person out of my life, I'm just kind of moving them further out in the circle. Yeah. Right. And it helps with that kind of feeling of guilt a little bit. But it's like, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You're not like telling them they suck or something like that, but it's just, sometimes it's necessary for your own growth that you kind of tighten up that circle a little bit.
Having those tougher conversations.
Yeah. Like you said, it's tougher when it is family or like a close friend, or even a spouse or something like that. Like, it gets tough.
Very tough.
Yeah. This is some great conversations. Is there anything that we haven't kind of touched on yet that you wanted to touch on? Because I know it's really important that we really touch on the men's mental health side of things. Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that is really important to you about men's mental health?
That's a really good question. It's a good counseling
question. It's a loaded question. It's probably not a fair question.
No, it's a great question. And I think it really just comes down to, if there's guys that are listening, or if there's guys that are listening to this, or people that have guys in their lives that are listening to this, taking that first step is always going to be the most difficult. I cannot tell you the number of times I jump on a discovery call with a guy and they said, man, I've been looking at your website for 6 months now, or I saw you on a podcast 3 months ago and I've been thinking about it and on the fence, and what's this person going to think, what that person's going to think. And like, I acknowledge it. It's tough. It's a scary thing to do, but taking that first step to reach out, which is often the hardest step, is going to pay dividends. So for somebody that's maybe terrified to actually take that step, that's really how we break down the stigma. Is, yes, of course, doing the work and actually going to the sessions, but it's being willing to have that moment of courage to just put your hand up, even if it's just to a counselor, and say, hey man, I need some help. I need somebody to talk to. So it doesn't get to that point, to that breaking point. Because I mean, we know the statistics of men and suicide is it's outrageous. Mm-hmm. So taking that first step is often the most difficult, but man, it's so important. So to me, that's the take home message from everything that I do, is really breaking down the stigma, one conversation and one guy at a time. But it takes us men to take that first step, which is often the hardest, and you're the one that needs to take it, but be willing to have that courage and take that first step.
Yeah. I did a men's retreat like a year ago, and like in the build up to it, I did it with a buddy of mine who's also in the wellness industry. And so while we were planning it, and then while we were promoting it, like we were recognizing, we're like, it's really hard to get men involved in this kind of stuff. Like, I think more so than we anticipated. And I remember having a conversation with him. His name's Tim Kessler, so shout out to Tim. But I remember having a conversation with him, and I was like, man, like, everybody that we talk to about it, like, you reach out to a guy and be like, hey, this might be something you're interested in. Every single guy, man, we need more of this in the world. We need more of this and stuff like that. But it's not the right time for me right now, or something like that. And I remember saying to him, like, it's almost like our responsibility as men to take part in some of these things, because that's what helps break the wall down. Like, when other men see you doing it, right? And it just speaks to what you were just saying. Is I came up with this thing. I joked with him about it, but I think it is true. Like, if you're not ready to do it for yourself, like, maybe take that chance on yourself for other men who are struggling. Because you going and taking that step, whether it's a retreat, whether it's going to your first counseling session, like, just like taking that step, that might be something that your son sees, or your brother sees, or your friend sees, or the person walking down the street sees you walk into the building that says therapy on the door or something. Like, that has an impact, right? Not that people should do things like that for other people, but
well, and that's what kind of lights me up about, you know, bigger celebrity type guys actually being open about their work in counseling and therapy, even coaching, whatever it might be, because it's like, okay, there's a lot of guys that look up to The Rock, for example, or a Ryan Reynolds type. And so now that gives permission. That's a big word right now, permission. Well, oh, they seem like they have it all together. And if they're struggling and need somebody to talk to, it gives me now permission to feel a bit more comfortable about taking that step.
Yeah, I agree. There's one other thing that I almost forgot about that I wanted to pick your brain on really quick. And it's this. So I feel like, and you can disagree with me, but I feel like the world kind of swings on a pendulum, right? And so for a long time, we were going very far to like the feminist side of things, right? And like women's rights and stuff like that, and which is very, very important, right? Now I feel like we're swinging towards the men's mental health side of things, and like masculinity and like toxic masculinity and all these types of things. Do you think we need to be careful not to swing too far as well? And I'm not really contexting this question well, but I'm curious if we can go too far to the side where we almost lose some masculinity in it, because I've heard different like kind of arguments about even the thing we talked about, like being a provider. So I think I saw it was like a Dana White interview recently that made me think of this, and he was saying something along the lines of like, he's like, no, like I don't want to go to therapy, like I don't want to like talk about my problems with my wife or anything like that. He's like, I like being the provider. It drives me. It pushes me. There's got to be a harmony with that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the pendulum swings allow us to find the harmony, right? There's a lot of polarizing thoughts and ideas out there, and I think that's certainly amplified given the social media world that we live in. Even 10 years ago, these conversations were happening. They just weren't as prominent because, you know, everybody can have their own news channel now, which for better or for worse. I mean, we're doing it here in a great way, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I'd say, you know, it's like we've got to kind of just trust that things are going to work out the way that they want to. And I mean, that's kind of a no answer. Yeah. But the reality is, man, is like we've got to have these swings to really figure out where that harmonious place is. You know, and even in my work, like I certainly see those conversations coming up with guys that are struggling, that see these messages of like hyper masculinity and, you know, the alpha, like, do I need to be the alpha in the relationship, or is my wife going to leave me, or are my kids not going to look up to me? So I think at a macro level, we're trying to figure it out. But at a micro level, as individuals, we've got to figure out where we stand as well as individual men, and ultimately that's going to create the tidal shifts that we're talking about here. Yeah, I love that. It's not about focusing on like what this person needs me to be. It always comes back to that, like, what feels good for me, right? And even certain conversations of like the they type conversations of like everybody, or where we're kind of polarizing it and making it this, you know, not as focused as it necessarily needs to be. That's why I think it starts with us, and then it grows from there. You know, that's well said. I know it's like an uncomfortable topic, but I think those are some of the topics that are important to have as well. Right? I felt uncomfortable even like asking the question. I'm like, okay, I got to make sure that I word this correctly, because I don't want it to come off. Again, it goes back to that whole thing of like, I don't want to come off like an anti-feminist or something. I'm not, and I'm also not like anti like masculinity. Like, it's about finding that balance. I know balance, that word balance that we both hate, but it's about finding that middle ground that just like feels good for you. And I think when you approach your values, like we talked about before, that really helps as well. Like, am I being true to my values? Does this make me feel good? Does it feel aligned? Those types of things. And that's a great word, that alignment piece. And it's somewhat of a moving target. As I grow, things are going to shift the way that I look at the world or receive other messages or whatever it might be. As roles change as well, right? That whole conversation around provider, once somebody is in a serious relationship, that then potentially becomes more front and center than when they're not. Right? Or, you know, dads that, you know, their kids have now moved out, maybe aren't feeling that as much, and maybe there's a sense of loss or even grieving that as well. So there's so many different layers that are going on simultaneously. Yeah. Awesome. This has been really fun. Yeah, man. I want to be respectful of your time. Yeah, no, it's all good. But this is, it's some really great conversations, and I hope that some men out there who maybe have been considering reaching out, reach out to Dustin and start a conversation. And like you said, that first step is the hardest, but you can take it, and it's safe, and it can be, you know, a powerful first step. Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, man. This is awesome. Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is fun, and we'll have to do it again sometime too. Sign me up. Yeah. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks to everybody for listening and watching. And make sure you check out the links in the description and in the show notes so you guys can connect.